welcome to our distinguished guests, the Honourable Jed Carney, Assistant Minister of Health and Aged Care, Professor Jane Gunn, Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences, colleagues, friends, guests and all. So as we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we are gathering today, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples. We recognise the unique place held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the original owners and custodians of the lands and waterways across the Australian continent, with histories of continuous connection dating back more than 60,000 years. We also acknowledge their enduring cultural practices of caring for country. We pay respect to elders past, present, and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. I'm Catherine Bowen, Professor of Climate, Environment and Global Health and Deputy Director of Melbourne Climate Futures here at the University of Melbourne. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all tonight to our inaugural Climate Catch Lab annual Oration. The Climate Collaborative Action for Transformative Change in Health and Healthcare Lab, otherwise known as the Climate Catch Lab, accelerates action towards climate resilient, sustainable and equitable communities and health systems in Australia and beyond. We are a collaborative, interdisciplinary network of researchers, practitioners, educators and strategic thinkers advancing knowledge and action at the nexus of climate change and human health. The lab's formal establishment 12 months ago comes at a pivotal moment in the history of human health and climate change research and policy landscape. We are now seeing an unprecedented level of attention and interest in climate change and human health. This means the harnessing and formalising of the university's strengths in this area is critical for us to be able to actively participate in policy debates and formulation, progress our applied research activities, and nurture the next generation of global health and climate change advocates. Ultimately, the lab is here as a collective to actively contribute to the rapid acceleration of tangible solutions in the race towards our healthy and sustainable societies. In this context, our inaugural Oration comes at a perfect time, and I'm thrilled to be able to share the stage with three incredible women. Kris, I can't quite see you there. This evening's orator, Professor Kris Ebi from the University of Washington, is a pioneer of this field, working over the last 3 decades with colleagues including the late Professor Tony McMichael, one of our shared mentors. Australia's Assistant Minister for Health and Aged Care, the Honourable Jed Carney, has shown her genuine commitment and leadership in this area and is now chairing the government's Climate and Health Expert Advisory Group with an aim to support the implementation of the government's landmark First National Climate and Health Strategy. And within the university family, our Dean, Professor Jane Gunn, has shown her strong conviction to act on the health impacts of climate change and has provided fundamental support to the Climate Catch Lab. To all 3 of our speakers tonight, we applaud your determination, wisdom and leadership. I would now like to warmly welcome the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences, Professor Jane Gunn, to provide some introductory remarks before we welcome Assistant Minister Carney, followed by our orator, Professor Kris Ebi. Thank you, Jane.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. I'm Jane Gunn, Dean of the Faculty, as Catherine has said, and I welcome you all here to Melbourne Connect this evening. I'd also like to pay my respects to Elders past, present and emerging, and any First Nations people here in the audience. I always like to acknowledge that when we're at Melbourne Connect, we're actually on the site of the old Royal Women's Hospital. And so there may be people that were actually born or worked within on this very plot of land. And whilst it's been a site of joy for many families, it's also been a site where some children were taken from their families. And it's always, I think, makes a time for us to pause and recognise that we have also to tell that truth, but also to recognise that together with our First Nations colleagues, there's been some wonderful work on this site, and there's a beautiful memorial birthing tree, not the night to go and look at it with the rain coming down, but it's a lovely birthing tree that the Wurundjeri people have helped the university and the City of Melbourne to establish, and some lovely poetry that's on the seats down in the atrium area of Melbourne Connect. So that's for something for you to look at on a nicer day, perhaps. I'm also delighted to be here to welcome our esteemed guest and keynote speaker, Kris Ebi, Professor of Global Health at the University of Washington. So welcome, Kris. I'm really looking forward to your oration this evening. And that you are a Magunya Fellow at the University of Melbourne this year. And the Magunya Fellows are a really special part of the university year, our annual, it's a fantastic fellowship. It always brings to our university and the City of Melbourne wonderful people that we learn a lot from, and I'm sure we will tonight. So thank you for what you will we are about to share with us, and what you've already given through your visit with us. And also to acknowledge our special guest, Assistant Minister for Health and Aged Care, the Honourable Jed Carney, and thank you very much for your support of all things that are important to the university. And I know there's many things that we share in common, and it's great to have you here. And to Catherine and the Climate Catch Lab, all the Melbourne Climate Futures teams that have really co-hosted and put this together. I know I'm biased, but we have a wonderful, really wonderful bunch of academics here at the university, and students and friends that are really committed to making a difference in this important area. And I know many people have been a part of bringing together the efforts around climate and health. And you know who you are. Many of you are here in this room. But Catherine, your leadership has been so valuable for the university, along with all the Melbourne climate features. And I don't know if Jackie Peel's here this evening. She's not able to be here this evening. But it really is wonderful to have this, to see the co-hosting of the event and to see this coming to life. I'm sure there's many people in this room who know much more about this topic than I do. As Catherine said, and I remember, George, I think you were part of the group that came and had a bit of a lunch with me a few years ago now, where we were talking about, look, what a huge problem this is, but what can we do? And it could be overwhelming. What could we do? We can't solve the entire problem, but we certainly can do things and work together to make a difference. And it was following that lunch, which I had with a group of students mostly, and it was a really inspiring lunch. And so after that, a lot of things, we actually did things, small steps, but even those small steps, I think, have really contributed to the momentum that is gaining. We know that we've got extreme weather events. We certainly have. We've experienced that both locally within our region and across the globe. And we know that the effects of climate change on health. I remember many, many years ago, a very close colleague, Dr. Grant Blaschke, I'm sure he's probably known to a few of you in the room. I remember him, really being a part of climate and health. It'd be 20 years ago. And us trying to get some stuff started around climate and health a very long time ago. And he just came up against battle after battle. And I often think that what's happening now is what Grant was desperately trying to get to happen in the faculty a very long time ago. Because we know that, the effects on health are real, and they really are becoming increasingly urgent that we look at the intersection between climate and health. We know within the faculty, sustainable healthcare is a real ambition of ours. It's a strategic priority. We're doing as much as we can, and I'd like to acknowledge the efforts of all the schools that are working together, because I think one of the things that we've spent time even today talking about is the real importance of working together in this area. We can't do it alone, and we have to avoid duplication and waste in everything that we do. As a university. That's a big call, but I think we're starting to see people putting the effort together, not reinventing the wheel, but working together and doing things that matter. Just a couple of things, obviously, with Catherine's appointment, that's been very important. We've also appointed an Associate Dean in Healthcare Sustainability, Associate Professor Forbes McGain, and an Enterprise Professor in Healthcare Sustainability, Eugenie Kayak. And I know Eugenie is here. I don't think Forbes is tonight. Oh, Eugenie's definitely here. I don't think Forbes is. But only last week we officially launched a living lab out at Western Health, the Healthcare Carbon Lab, in collaboration with the hospital. And that really is going to provide data through the life cycle assessment research of what the carbon footprint is in health and how people can then start to make decisions about things that they choose, clinical decisions that are made every single day by nurses and doctors and allied health members and hospital administrators, made every single day. How can they make better decisions to start to address the impact of healthcare, which of course we know is essential on the carbon footprint. So I know we've got very high hopes for all the work that's underway. We're very proud of the work that has been already led by the Catch Lab. For example, the 2023 Australia Awards Fellowship saw 15 fellows from the Indo-Pacific region attend a 6-week training and mentorship program, which was designed by the Climate Catch Lab and Melbourne Climate Futures to help them advance climate and health resilience and outcomes in their own countries. And I know that this is, such an important work, and I'm sure will yield a lot of benefit. Catherine herself has played a very important role as a lead author on the IPCC Working Group 6th Assessment Report. I'm sure it makes for great nighttime reading, Catherine. And the team has also contributed their expertise to key policies, the National Health and Climate Strategy for the federal government, which is enabling great steps forward. And I know Catherine herself is serving on the committee that Assistant Minister Jed Carney is chairing. So we're delighted that the Assistant Minister for Health and Aged Care can be here this evening. I'd now like you to join with me and welcome Jed Carney to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Gunn and Professor Bowen. And you're right, I can see you over there, and your team for organising the event tonight. And I was so thrilled to be invited to come along. There's so many wonderful people in the room. I know a lot of you. I know you've played a great part in the work that we've been trying to do federally. If I started to say one name, I'd miss someone. But I really am starting to feel like I'm in a room of, there's a world of friends around climate and health, and this university has played a huge part in building that community. And so thank you for all the work that you've done. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land as well that we meet, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to First Nations people attending this event today. We thank First Nations people for their custodianship of these lands and waterways and appreciate what we can learn from them when it comes for caring for our environment and managing the impacts of climate change. I also would like to pay tribute to Professor Kris Ebi, I apologise, a trailblazer and a world expert in the field of climate and health. It's quite an honour to be here today with such an internationally renowned researcher and to hear the inaugural Climate Catch Lab Oration. Well, I've been involved with work that looks at the intersection of health and climate change for some time. But my involvement, and I'm sure many people's here, is not nearly as extensive or as impressive as yours, Dr. Ebi. With a 25-year career supporting countries across the globe and conducting research and practice in the field, I can't tell you how excited I am to hear your oration. So thanks everyone for coming here also to listen tonight. It's a great crowd on a cold, wintry Melbourne evening, and it's wonderful to see you all here. I also want to extend a big thanks to Climate Catch Lab, a joint initiative of the School of Population and Global Health and the Melbourne Medical School. You're bringing together the best and the brightest to tackle what the World Health Organization has called the single biggest health threat facing humanity, climate change. And this is needed. And as you said, Professor Gunn, this is not a challenge that anyone can do on their own, not governments, not the university. Governments in particular will play a big part, I'm aware of that, but we need everybody on board, our academics, our researchers, our activists, governments, businesses, schools, hospitals. The list could go on and on. In fact, when I was doing the consultation on the climate and health strategy, I was absolutely amazed at the organisations, the individuals, groups of people who had input into the development of that strategy. So thank you all for the work that you are doing. I'd like to touch a little bit on the work that the Albanese Labor government is doing in the climate and health space, and just mention that all this work is absolutely 100% supported by the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Kris Ebi, who I don't know if anybody heard at the press club today. He made an amazing speech about all the things that the government is actually pressing for when it comes to climate change, and along with the Assistant Minister, Jenny McAllister, who has a particular interest in the climate and health strategy, we are working incredibly hard. It's been nearly 6 months since I launched the first National Health and Climate Strategy. I was so lucky and honoured to be able to go to Dubai for the COP28 to announce that. So many of you have provided ideas for the strategy, and thank you especially to Professor Bowen, as well as to Professor Eugenie Kayak, who I understand is here, Associate Professor Forbes McGain, Dr. Sonia Chanchlani, Mr. Arthur Wins, all of who contributed so much to the work on climate and health. We couldn't have done it without you. As you would be aware, the strategy has two primary aims. One, to make our health system more resilient and better equipped to cope with the health effects of climate change, such as high heats and smoke from bushfires. And two, to reduce the contribution of the health system itself to climate change. It's been just over 6 months since the strategy was launched, and progress has already been made. I'm pleased to be able to share with you some of the biggest advances, just some examples of what we've been working on. I'm very pleased to say that we have established and expanded the National Health, Climate and Sustainability Unit within the department from 2 people to 15 people. So I'm very pleased with that. And this demonstrates our commitment to having the capability to try to implement or to actually implement the strategy. We're nearing the completion of a national baseline estimates of emissions from our health system, so it's great to see the work that you're doing here. That will certainly feed into that, an essential starting point for a decarbonisation roadmap, which we have also started work on. We've completed the first pass assessment of climate change risks to health and wellbeing for the National Climate Risk Assessment. This is a cross-government effort, a whole-of-government effort and multiple levels of government effort. And the second pass on priority risks is well underway. In collaboration with Melbourne University, we're finalising a guide to detecting and reducing leaks of nitrous oxide in Australian hospitals, which I'm sure you're aware is a major contributor to emissions from the health system. We'll soon be publishing new research on opportunities to reduce health system emissions from food and waste. We are very pleased that we have formally joined an international collaboration with NHS in England, the US Department of Health and Human Services, Ireland and Norway, among others. And the collaboration will aim to decarbonise global health system supply chains, which in this country are estimated to account for an astonishing 75% of our health sector's carbon footprint. It's interesting, just as an aside, that a lot of the big pharma companies have already started to present to me their bona fides when it comes to decarbonising their supply chain. Very interesting, because they think that they can see something coming down the track. Labor is determined to add Australia's weight to efforts to firstly make suppliers disclose their emissions and secondly set targets for reducing them. So there has been some progress in only 6 short months, and that's just some of the highlights. And in exciting news on next steps, as has been mentioned, we've established the Climate and Health Expert Advisory Group. Now, it hasn't got as catchy an acronym as CATCH. It works out to be CHEEG. I don't like it. But anyway, we'll think of something. But this group despite the acronym. It will be a fantastically important group. I'm really excited to chair the first meeting on the 1st of August here in Melbourne, and it will give us advice on climate and health policy and guide the implementation of the strategy. So that's an incredibly important group. As mentioned before, we need everyone on board to achieve the goals of the strategy, and one component of this is the role of research and academics. Research is essential. It underpins all our efforts. And so we are so pleased to provide funding for new research on climate and health, both through the National Health and Medical Research Council and the MRFF. We've commissioned a review of current and past Australian research to identify knowledge gaps. And again, with the help of researchers, we'll soon publish a systematic mapping review of current and past research on climate change and health in Australia. So this is important in identifying the gaps and ensure that our future research is targeted to those priorities. I am so grateful for the very strong work being done in universities and other organisations, especially what's being done at the Climate Catch Lab. If we are truly to accelerate action to address the health impacts of climate change, we're going to need the strongest, most effective partnerships that we can build across research, across governments, across industries, across our communities. And I'm so pleased to see that the Climate Catch Lab is focused on interdisciplinary collaboration. So thank you to everyone here today. I look forward to continuing to work with you on research, funneling your findings into the work of government. And on that note, Professor Ebi, thank you for the work you're doing to help make the future safer, to make it healthier for our nation and our planet. And I take very, very great pleasure in passing over to you now for your oration. Thank you.
Thank you really very much. It's quite an honor to be here with these wonderful women, and really appreciate the very kind introduction, and really very honored to be here. And congratulations, Assistant Minister, for all the work that you're doing. I do the science, I don't do the implementation, and really important that there's people who do that. All right, we'll see how this works. Catherine, Professor Bowen, asked that I start at the beginning. The beginning is Professor Tony McMichael, who laid out the field of climate change and health and planetary overload in 1993. And he foresaw where we are today. He outlined the field, he outlined the risks. In the IPCC, we've just reiterated what he outlined from the beginning. He was a real visionary, and his loss was just immense to the field. We've heard a little bit about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. It conducts regular assessments. That's what its role is. Governments decide every few years they'd like to have another assessment, which is when we as scientists become involved. This is a quick summary of the human health chapter in the last report. Professor Bowen and I were both on that chapter. And on the left-hand side, you can see the headline statement. People are already suffering and dying from climate change. We have evidence for that. This is no longer a future possibility, it's today. On the left are the observations. You can see the major categories in which the assessment was done. There's obviously lots of detail behind this, but it gives you a sense of the range of what has been researched. And on the right are the projections. Same kind of categories, but gives a sense of where the focus of the research community has been. And this comes with a big caveat. The major challenge we faced in climate change and health for the last several decades is funding. There's been extremely little funding. Very glad to hear there's going to be more funding. But the funding, every scientist says there's not enough funding. I understand how that sounds. But we haven't had funding. I wrote 3 papers so far on this. When you look at funding until last fall under the US National Institutes of Health, for several decades, the funding was less than 0.02% of their budget. And as a consequence, this list is short. There are hundreds of climate-sensitive health outcomes that are of concern. Most of the research is focused on heat because that's where the research community has been able to get some funding. But even with that, we've got this broad outline illustrating the challenges that we face. When we talk about climate change and health, from my perspective, it's critically important to think about the framing on your left. The framing comes from the IPCC. It's been used in the IPCC for a couple of dozen years now. And it basically says that as we look into the future, we're thinking about risk. Risk is probability times consequence. Risk is always uncertain. And risk, when you think about climate change and health, is formed of, I'll say, 4 main factors. The first is the exposures because of the hazards of a changing climate. So we know a lot about the hazards. We've got some great climatologists here who can tell us about the hazards. We've got research that talks about the exposure. And critically important, we also know a lot about groups that are particularly vulnerable. As a health professional, I would separate those into people who are susceptible to harm, and though our health systems, how capable are they of managing? Another way of saying this is when we look at climate change and health, we don't just think about climate change. We think about everything else as well. We have to understand the local context. I do a lot of work globally on climate change and health, but I can't say exactly what could happen in any location because that local context is critically important. On the right-hand side is one of, I don't know, more than 100 figures that lays out how climate change could be affecting our health and well-being. For those of you who knew Tony well, all of us can remember sitting in meetings with Tony where he would pass the time drawing these up. He himself produced probably 50 of these. He really found it fascinating to figure out how he could best describe the interactions. But this lays out just some of the health outcomes. I'll just breeze through a few, but I want to focus a lot as well on solutions. Every IPCC report ends up with a synthesis report, and the synthesis report always has an iconic figure of how could temperature change going into the future under different assumptions of greenhouse gas emissions. For the first time ever, that figure used the warming stripes. How many of you seen the climate stripes before? Quite a few of you had. So yeah, use the climate stripes, and for the first time ever, people are on that. And this is the most downloaded figure from the IPCC. And it really helps illustrate some of the issues we think about in health. That when we look at what could happen in the future under different assumptions of greenhouse gas emissions, it's going to affect people differently. It depends on when you're born. For those of you who are in the health sector, there's a well-known approach to studies called cohort studies, and these are cohort effects, that people born in different time periods will have very different exposures that will affect their lives throughout their lives. Specifically for health, this looks just at 4 of the climate-sensitive health outcomes. This is something also that's quite common in the IPCC, and this figure goes back to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Article 2 of the convention states that the ultimate purpose of the convention is to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. This was signed off on by all the world governments, who then turned around to the IPCC, to the scientists, and said, how do we define dangerous? Dangerous was a negotiated language, and we can all think of some activities. We have friends and colleagues who do things that we think, I would never do that. So the third assessment report did a complete review of how one thinks about dangerous, how one frames it, came up with a particular framework that still is used in the IPCC, and then synthesized all the literature at the time. That synthesis results in these figures, and I'll walk through the figure for just a moment. The baseline, as you look across, are pre-industrial temperatures. Then up the y-axis are increases in global mean surface temperature above that baseline. When you look at each of these bars where the color is white, it means it's not possible scientifically to determine whether that system has changed over time. It may not have changed. It could have changed, but we don't have enough data. We just don't know. When the color changes to gold, it means that, in fact, there has been a change in that system, and I'll use heat-related morbidity and mortality. So heat-related morbidity and mortality have changed over time. And there has been a scientific assessment called detection and attribution to say that at least part of that change is because of climate change. So the gold is where we know climate change is affecting our health and well-being. When the color changes to red, the risk is high. When it changes to purple, the risk is very high. On the scientific side, the issue we really focus on for each of these bars is where's that transition in terms of temperature. The program we use puts those great big dots on it. The number of dots at each transition point just tells you how confident we are. More dots, more confident. The gray bar across this, at the time this was done, it was in preparation for the IPCC special report on warming of 1.5 degrees. That was where global mean surface temperature was at the time. And then finally, what we did in health, which has only been done in health so far, is we also looked at what would happen under different assumptions of adaptation. The left-hand bar in each is a world in which there's high challenges to adaptation and to mitigation. The one in the middle is a world like today where we muddle through. Do some things well, it takes too long, some things we don't quite achieve. The one on the right is a world aiming to sustainable development. And so hopefully, while I've been going on about this, you've looked at these figures and they tell you how important it is to both adapt and to mitigate. We have to do both. We can't focus on just one. And then finally, because of the color scheme, everybody calls these the burning embers. And they are completely familiar to IPCC focal points, so that when we go through and we reach the end of a report and we take the summary for policymakers to the focal points, they understand these. They find them useful. When we went through the burning embers for the last report, the most common comment over the about 8 or 9 hours we spent on the burning embers was, why are there not more embers? Why are there not embers for my country, for my region, for the topic I'm worried about? And there's going to be a lot more of these coming out. And because they're such useful communication tools, I hope that some of you will remember some of this and look for these as they go forward. This is a great moment to stop and acknowledge the huge inequities at the heart of climate change and health. We know that the impacts of a changing climate on our health and well-being are not equally distributed. There's regions, there's people, there's populations that are a lot more vulnerable. And some of those vulnerabilities are historic. In the United States, within our cities, we have areas that are called redlined districts. In the 1930s, city leaders, politicians who were responsible for planning of cities would take a map of a city and literally draw a red line over less desirable areas. And that's the place where Black and brown residents could live. And even today, redline districts are hotter than the surrounding area. They had different construction materials, houses were closer spaced, and they had fewer trees. And so there's this legacy of choices that were made decades, almost a century ago, that are still affecting people today. The other point I wanted to make is that there's a really good understanding all of the health risks of a changing climate are current problems. There certainly will be new things that arise, but pretty much we know what the landscape looks like. And therefore, from all of the work that's been done in research and by health systems over the last 150 years, we know which groups are more vulnerable. We know which places are more vulnerable. And so health, as opposed to other sectors, is starting in a very different place of knowing where we need to focus. I also wanted to point out, in thinking about the burning embers, is that we've got a variety of analytic techniques using scenarios that can be very useful for us in the health sector that we haven't capitalized on yet. This is some research that was done by Ed Byers at EASA at using the scenarios that have come out, and I find these incredibly helpful. This represents analyses that were done for 14 sectors. One of them was heat. And this is a world that continues to muddle through. I mentioned that before. But these are different temperatures. It's a world that goes at 2, does not go past 1.5 as a long-term average, 2 degrees and 3 degrees. And the analysis looked at who's exposed and vulnerable to poverty, and look at the difference between a 1.5 degree world and a 3 degree world. This is motivation for policymakers to say how important it is to think about climate and about development. The analyses down here held the world at 2 degrees, but looked at different scenarios. This is a scenario aiming at sustainable development. This is muddling through, and this is a world with very high challenges to adaptation and mitigation. And again, it powerfully illustrates, even if we keep global mean surface temperature below 2 degrees, our development choices matter. That we can't separate climate change. It can't be a standalone activity. There's a lot of researchers in the room, so here's a research agenda I'm more or less going to talk about, but probably not. Happy to come back to this later on, but it lays out, pretty much following what Tony laid out in Planetary Overload, what it is we need to do in terms of the research. And so there's lots of understanding of where we are and really where we need to be. I'm happy to talk about any of these if you want to talk about them later. And with that, I wanted to move on about how we're going to manage all these challenges. The World Health Organization has a large and growing number of documents to help direct ministries of health into how they can better prepare and manage these growing challenges. I apologize for the quality of this. WHO seems to be able to produce PDFs that if you take something out of are always fuzzy, right? There's just, I've emailed folks at WHO and said, can I get a clean copy of this? And they said, we don't have a clean copy either. The documents are just fuzzy. Anyway, WHO has identified building blocks of health systems, which is this fuzzy thing on the left, and on the right, what we need to do in terms of our health care. That's recognizing that there's actions that need to be taken to increase the resilience of our health care, the kind of work that's going on here. And there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of capacity building, governance, research, and implementation to help increase the resilience of people and communities. WHO recognizes that we can't focus on just adaptation or mitigation and put this together to start thinking about where should health systems focus. And so this, you can think these are high-income countries here. They've got good performing health systems. They've got high greenhouse gas emissions. I was surprised in all of the introductions, nobody mentioned that worldwide 5% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from healthcare. In the United States, it's 8 or 9%. In Brazil, it's 7%. In some other countries, it's a bit lower. Obviously, low and middle income countries, it's next to 0. But it's critically important because of the role of the health sector in both generating emissions and then having to treat the people who are suffering from climate-sensitive health outcomes because of our own emissions. So this is the high-income countries, these are low-income countries, and pointing out that as one thinks about adaptation and mitigation, there's different focus in different places. 80% of all of our emissions come from just 20 countries. So most of the countries, you really need to focus on the adaptation, on the people who are suffering right now from changing weather patterns. The first step in trying to understand at a country level or at a national level, the same, obviously, country and national level, at a subnational level, what you need to do is to conduct a vulnerability and adaptation assessment. There's well-established methods in health and in all sectors, so these are common activities across all the sectors. This pretty much follows the figure I showed you towards the beginning of the talk, and they're kind of easy processes in the sense to understand. What are your challenges today? What problems are you facing? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Where do you need additional help? And it works through this in a formal process. You come out with a series of recommendations that go then into an adaptation plan, which provides direction for seeking investment of where to place whatever investment you can manage to raise to help improve your health system. I phrase that the way I did. I know it's a little bit awkward, but when you look up until December of how much funding was going under the adaptation funds to climate and health, it was less than half of 1% of all the adaptation funds to any other sector. So it's really received extremely little funding. There's a long list of effective adaptation options. This is from the IPCC chapter. I've talked for a little bit about strengthening our health systems. The rest of them we can talk about. It's the kinds of things you would expect of really making sure our health systems are fit for purpose. And the bullet at the bottom is, if I hadn't already said so, it was a reminder to myself to talk about the constraint of funding. There's lots that can be done. Early warning systems. In 2022, the World Meteorological Organization said they're going to spend several $billion on early warning systems for all. I don't know if you can read the numbers, but 50% of all disasters over the last 50 years were weather, climate, or water events. That over the last 50 years, on average, it's the right-hand side, there's a disaster that's occurred every day. And so there's lots of opportunities in these early warning systems, and they have to go beyond the warning, they have to go to the response. It's not just telling people it's hot. What is it that they need to do? Speaking of heat, there is a global heat health information network that is collaborating worldwide on really improving heat wave early warning and response systems. I'm going to a meeting next week in Singapore where we're going to try and really up what we've been doing in this space to make sure that more communities start implementing these systems. Not wait until you have the heat wave and people die, but to do it in advance so that you can be prepared. The UK has had a heat wave early warning system for quite some time, and so it's a great program to look at. It's very well developed. I've got some of the core elements here. It's been very well informed by the evidence. It has strong engagement across society, and based on their particular context, they have 4 different alert levels. And despite this well-developed system, despite all the advances they've made, the number of lives that they've saved, last year there was a massive heat wave, a historic heat wave that was beyond anything anybody had ever experienced. And there was about 1,000 people who died, who didn't have to die in that heat wave, and just illustrated the challenges we're facing, that we do have lots of early warning systems. Unfortunately, many of them are not considering climate change. They're stopping with weather and not thinking about how the climate is changing. There's lots that can be done. Again, this is about heat, but thinking about actions that can be taken. I mentioned redlining, that we need to ensure that we've got places that are cool. In the EU, there is a directive that every city is supposed to try and have 30% tree cover. And so somebody did an analysis last year, 2 years ago, and said, what if we really do have 30% tree cover? How many deaths can we prevent? And the rates are really quite high. It's quite effective. And to echo the themes you've already heard on multidisciplinary, it's not planting any tree, it's planting a tree that's going to survive in a warmer climate. And so it's talking with your ecologist friends of what would survive here in 50 years. I'll make a few comments on mitigation. It's always a tough topic to approach. This is my most depressing slide. This goes back to 1990. I've got those that go back to 1900. They all look the same, just a linear increase in emissions, major world events, and really almost no change in that linear trend. The United Nations Environment Program every year puts out the emissions gap report. This is last year's. They all have a figure pretty much like this, where this is our ambition and here's where we are. And it goes into detail at regional levels, national levels, but really shows the impressive gap between where we want to be and where we are. And the health sector has an important message here. This was put together by Professor Bowen and Dr. Workman in the audience. When you look at the major categories of mitigation policies and technologies, they all have benefits for our health and well-being. There's at least 100 studies now that have looked at different mitigation policies and technologies and have calculated the avoided hospitalizations, the avoided premature deaths. If you have more people walking and biking, people are healthier, people are happier, they lose weight, they have less cardiovascular disease. So all of that can be quantified. And the net result of all of these studies is when you look at each of these categories, if we implement these mitigations, that the benefits of those avoided hospitalizations, avoided premature deaths, are of the same order of magnitude, if not larger, than the cost of mitigation. We should be mitigating for our health. And those benefits will be sooner than the benefits for the planet. And this is a very strong message that the health sector needs to get out. Professor Andy Haynes at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine recently initiated the Pathfinder Initiative, which built off of this understanding to collect case studies, where people can actually see in a particular case study what the benefits were in reducing emissions and the benefits for health. I put this together into this figure. On the upper left, it's agriculture, forestry, and other land use, and showed the changes that they could see. These are actual programs people put in place, and the benefits on the right. So this is a first pass. It's really quite beneficial. And then use this information to opine about what we need to do as a society to have a just and equitable transition. This all came out. It's got a great website. I encourage people to look at this because it can be quite useful in multiple contexts. The IPCC is very fond of overcomplicated figures. Catherine and I have opined about their figures, and really, here you go. I put it in here anyway because it makes the point the future's uncertain. And there's lots of pathways to the future. There's not one pathway, there's multiple pathways. We want to get to the top right, where we have low emissions, transitions, transformations, low climate risk, equity and justice, and achieving the SDGs. But how we get there can go through a lot of different pathways. Our individual and collective choices will determine those pathways. It's not out of the realm of possibility we can achieve that more perfect world we would like to live in. So where we are today, there was a major shift in the landscape for climate and health at the last conference of the parties. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is a UN convention. When a country signs that convention, they become a party to the convention. That's all the Conference of the Parties mean. It's the conference of all the countries that have signed on to the convention. The last year was COP28. It was in Dubai. There was a Climate and Health Day, first time ever. And this is the Climate and Health Declaration, some of the key components of that. There was lots of work behind the scenes into achieving this declaration. There was leadership from the country, from the World Health Organization, from philanthropists, from a group of others to make this happen. It was very exciting. And you can see there were financial commitments, people who've said, actually, we are going to spend money on this. And I've got a few of those listed. And there was about $1 billion in pledges. And pledges are just that. They're a promise that there is an intent. So there are now people running around trying to turn those pledges into actual commitments. And then just a few weeks ago, the last World Health Assembly called upon their member states to take a range of actions around climate change and health. And so there's now a mandate within the World Health Organization, within ministries of health, to take action. And to do that in partnership with their colleagues in the meteorological services on, for example, the early warnings for all. It's a very much transdisciplinary approach, making sure that everybody works together to try and achieve the aims of increasing overall resilience to climate change and health. And with that, thank you very much for listening. And I never wear a watch, but I assume I've left time for questions.
Thank you so much, Kris. That was just fantastic. I'm sure the audience will agree. Your portrayal of both the history of climate change, where we started, where we are now, and also the priorities for the research community are really important for us all to consider in our day-to-day work. Because even if you don't recognise it now, I'm sure all of the work you're doing does have a climate change and human health element to it. We do have some time now for questions from the audience, so we've just got a few minutes before then we have some more time for refreshments. But does anyone have a question? Up the back.
Yeah, Kris, we have had 28 climate change conferences. But the emissions continue to go up. And it seems to me that the problem is that the COP process is framed within capitalist parameters. It doesn't use that word, but there are people that are basically saying that we need to deal with the elephant in the room, namely capitalism, the ultimate social determinant of health, and talk about shifting to an alternative world system based on social parity and justice, deep democracy, not the kind of democracy you have in the US or we have here in Australia, environmental sustainability and a safe climate. Vandana Shiva in India calls it earth democracy. I'm of the camp that calls it eco-socialism. Your thoughts along those lines?
Easy first question.
Thanks, and I'd like to go back to the beginning. One of the challenges we face throughout climate change is we don't have any counterfactuals. We don't know what the world would be like if we didn't have any COPs. We work extensively on how you think about in health and other sectors. We don't know what it would be like if we didn't have climate change. For those of you who are studying it in health and ecosystems and others, you don't have a control group. And so it's important to think about the consequences of that. Where could we be if we didn't have the COPs? Where could we be if we didn't have the work that has been done to try and bring emissions down? We know that emissions are changing. They're not changing rapidly enough. And I will say about the COP, I've been to a few, is that one of the really impressive things about the COP is everybody shows up. It's not like any country walks away. Countries threaten to walk away from it. Countries show up year after year. And despite everything that's going on, they want to be part of this conversation. And I will say, in their defense, for as frustrating and slow as the process is, I'm from the US, so I'll talk about our national holiday, Thanksgiving. Try to think about getting all of your relatives to agree on anything. There's 195 of them in the room, and they can't agree on the agenda. They can't agree on the priorities. They can't agree on the order. And they all work at it. And so taking some time to think about what it must be like for people to dedicate so much time, energy, and effort to try and move forward. And I will say the countries are incredibly committed. I've been in negotiations in the middle of the night where every country has to agree on every word in every text. And it gets down to one country, and I've seen negotiators walk out, wake up their prime minister at 2 o'clock in the morning to say, can I agree to this? They take this very seriously. And it is easy to talk about how slow it is. I understand all of those frustrations. But also, when you watch the process, to appreciate the dedication to the process. The other point is we need to recognize that change is here. I was so impressed a couple of weeks ago, the front cover of The Economist was the dawn of the solar age. I didn't know the statistics. The Economist is very good on finding statistics. In 2004, it took the world a year to install a gigawatt of solar power. That's enough power to run 876,000 homes. That's 2004. In 2012, it took a month. In 2016, 2017, it took a week. Last year, there were days where a gigawatt of solar power was installed. They think that this is unstoppable. And their article was about, imagine this world we're entering. By 2030, solar is going to produce more energy than gas. 2032, it's going to produce more energy than coal. It showed all of the projections, the most optimistic projections from any NGO on what would happen with solar, and they were so far off of where we are today. And so they're asking the question, what's it going to be like to live in a world where everybody has abundant energy? It's free or incredibly cheap, and there's a lot of it. What does it mean for Africa? What does it mean for ensuring people have access to safe water and sanitation? What does it mean when we can just go out and do things without having to think about the energy? And as I said, it's already here. So a story I like to tell is my story, so that's why I like to tell it, is I went grocery shopping. I parked in an underground parking garage. It's full of concrete. I'm walking back to the car, carrying all my bags, having the internal discussion people have as they come out of the grocery store of, why didn't I bring the cart? Because I'm trying to carry like 6 bags of groceries, and maybe I should have brought the cart with me. And at some point, I heard wind chimes. And I couldn't figure out where the wind chimes came from. I calculated the distance to the exit. I thought about everything around the exit. I'm trying to figure out how I can hear wind chimes with all of this concrete. And it finally dawned on me, I didn't hear a single internal combustion engine. I only heard electric vehicles. They all have to make a tinkling noise at low speed, and heaven forbid that Tesla should sound like a Ford. Right? And so they all make these different noises. And I stood there thinking, this is the future. This is the parking garage of the future. This is what people are going to hear when they go into parking garages. It's not going to be dirty, smelly, noisy. You're just going to hear the tires. What does it mean for our cities when it becomes attractive to move back to the main streets because there's no longer pollution? How are cities going to adjust when people want to live on the main street because the bus is right there? Right? And so there's a lot of change that's coming our way. It's already started to come our way. And the more we celebrate the change that's going on, the more we can accelerate and make sure we reduce our emissions as fast as we can. Thank you. That's my little rant.
Great answer to a very tricky question, Kris. Any other questions? Yes, time for one. Can you please, sorry, I should have said introduce yourself.
Oh, that's all right.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. My name is Scott Tonkin. So I guess I'm just interested in your thoughts around obviously the transition to net zero is inevitable, and first world countries have a big advantage there with regards to money and the investments that are required. So what's the solutions around third world countries who obviously are the ones who are got significant impacts when it comes to health and other effects of climate change? And how do we get around that without, I guess, just creating like a fund that they can all tap into, which obviously won't happen, but it would be nice in a perfect world. But
There is a fund.
But what other solutions is there to actually gain the motivation for these third world countries that don't actually have the financial backing?
Yeah, it is a real big challenge. There are several funds where countries can tap into. There's also quite a lot of work to leapfrog technology. You go into Africa and there's so many cell phones and there's no landlines. They just completely leapfrog that technology. They also have ways, it's what is it, where the way they send money. So they send money through their cell phones. They don't even have banking systems. Yeah, but it's I forgot what it is. But anyway, so there's lots of interest in doing this leapfrogging of technology. There's been lots of emphasis on thinking about particularly solar in Africa because it's a great place to have solar. So there's people who are thinking about how to move those investments forward. And it is critically important that we do so. Their current emissions are nothing, but their potential future emissions are large. If you think it's really challenging to negotiate on emissions, there is a subset of people at the COP who talks about intellectual property. And you've got negotiators who come in, and I'll use my country as an example. Whoever comes in from my country can't give away GE's technology. And how to find ways to do that technology transfer has been a long-term theme in the COP, having the business leaders there to think about how to facilitate that kind of change that needs to be made. So this is a well-recognized issue. It's also recognized that Africa is going to be a critical player in all dimensions in the world over the next several decades, and finding ways to help solve that in a way that's equitable and make sure that we do increase resilience and bring along everybody to the extent that you can. It's a good question.
And I'd just quickly add to that too. Kris and I work a lot together, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, and we know that most of the time the answers are within the people we're working with. And so it's actually also about how do we enable that conversation, how do we enable that sharing of understanding and knowledge, and pushing that out into audiences that aren't necessarily receiving it. So, but it's a really good question. Yeah. I think is there a burning question? Final one? Anyone? Otherwise,
everybody's just really looking forward to
the
drinks.
We do. Rahana, off the back. We do have one final question from...
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I actually wanted to link up to your point on technology transfer. By the way, the third world is also called the Global South nowadays. And technology finance is obviously a huge aspect in terms of the historic climate debt. And a lot of third world governments are very, very sensitive to that. And governments such as India, for example, won't be told what to do with their coal because it's linked to this finance and historic climate debt of the Western countries by and large. But on technology transfer, which is also, I think, a really important aspect of it, but we also need the appropriate technology. We don't need Tesla electric vehicles dumped in a context where there is no basis for it. We don't need 5G mobile phones in every place. 3G would do very well, thank you. So, any comments on that whole question of technology transfer, which is an essential aspect of this in terms of low and middle income countries?
One of the ways that climate change is pushing health and pushing lots of other sectors, particularly on the adaptation side, is what Catherine just said, that you have to work in the local context, that this is not a top-down activity. And all those adaptation funds, you have to partner with communities. You have to hear what their concerns are, understand what their aspirations are, what kinds of capacities they have, and to start there. And that's the standard for adaptation. It's very different from what we do in public health. Public health is just a top-down activity. We decide there's a problem, we do some studies, we do a standard risk assessment, we apply it everywhere. That's not what we do in climate change. And that then applies to all of these other aspects of making sure there is deep engagement. And that's, frankly, one of the reasons the COP is so important, is because you have representatives from every single country. And they are excellent at bringing forward their strengths, their concerns, and making sure that those are taken into account in these discussions about how to move forward. There's been several COPs where they were not listened to, and they walked out for several days and created a real challenge within the COP process to not have all of these countries. And so it is recognized we have to work with them. In fact, they have to lead in most cases. And so the kind of work that we've done in the Indo-Pacific has been going and providing our technical expertise, but knowing the real experts are those who live in the country. And they're the ones who are going to take up what makes sense for them, and they're the ones who are going to move forward. And making sure that we build capacity along the way so that they do become leaders, and that is happening in many countries that we've worked in the Pacific. And it's really gratifying to see that, to now see people that we've worked with giving keynote addresses because they're the experts. That's happening in the technology transfer as well, and that's starting to really infiltrate business, understanding if they want to be successful, they've got to work with that local community and not take the traditional Western approach to addressing problems because honestly, they don't understand the problems. There was a great moment, we did some work in Cambodia. We worked for many, many years with the WHO representative in Cambodia. He moved on to other countries. And I remember sitting down at dinner one time with him, and he started complaining about all these Western companies coming in, trying to help with sanitation systems, and not understanding how different garbage is in Cambodia than it is in a high-income country. And his example was, we eat apples. Your apples are great, by the way. I love apples. I went to the store and got some of your apples. You know, but their fruit is like durian. You know, you don't do a digester that's made for apples and be able to put durian through it. And so just talking about the failure of Western approaches to come in without understanding that local context. Somebody else has got their hand up now, but we can do that later.
Thank you so much, Kris. Can you all join with me in thanking Kris again? Thank you so much, Kris. Kris will be back in Melbourne later in the year, in October, for a couple of weeks through the Migunya Fellowship. And so there'll be plenty more opportunities for really practically focused activities as well, so workshops, policy roundtables and similar activities. So as we finish up this evening, I would like to thank my colleagues at the Climate Catch Lab and Melbourne Climate Futures for all of your efforts in pulling this Oration together. It's been a massive year for our teams at the university. As you can see in the impact report that we have shared with you here, and there's also some hard copies out the front. And it's wonderful to be able to celebrate our inaugural Oration with you all this evening.